We are back from the founding conference of the Revolutionary Communist International. If you look at our podcast feed, you'll see 2 episodes posting this week. This one that you're listening to and another one called What is Imperialism? Both of these episodes were recorded at the founding conference by the American delegation comrades Antonio Balmer and John Peterson. We definitely recommend that comrades go to the link below with the playlist that includes all of the sessions from that week, not just from the American comrades, but from the other comrades from a bunch of different sections that did leadoffs at this event. But we edited these episodes. There's usually pauses for translations during these events because it's an international event and not everybody's native language is English. Those pauses have been cut out for this episode. Without further ado, we will go right into Antonio's leadoff on how the Bolshevik Party was built.
What the Bolsheviks achieved in 1917 has no parallel in history up to the present day. A country of 160 million people. When the revolution broke out, the Bolsheviks had 8,000 members. That's one Bolshevik for every 20,000 inhabitants in the country. That would be like a revolution breaking out here in Italy, country of 69 million, and starting with a party of like 3,500 people. And within the space of the next 8 months, the party grew 30-fold, and it won the support of millions. It overthrew the provisional government. It brought the Soviets to power, and it built the first workers' government in history that was able to hold on to power. They particularly won the working class, which was a minority of the Russian population. If you take just the industrial factory workers of Russia, by October, nearly 1 out of 15 of them was a member of the Bolshevik Party. Now, we don't have time to have a detailed review of 1917 itself, but my goal is to discuss what it took to prepare the Bolsheviks for October. What was it that made those 8,000 Bolsheviks capable of performing what appeared to be a miracle? Because if we ask ourselves, what does it mean to build a Bolshevik Party? At what point do we get to look back at our work and say, good work, comrades, we did it. We have a Bolshevik Party now. That day will only come when we're prepared to carry out the same achievement that the Bolsheviks did. In the last decade, there was a wave of a different type of socialism that became popular around the world. Talking about the 2010s. In the US, it was the Sanders craze and Corbyn in Britain. And that trend had a mouthpiece. It had a publication that came along with it, Jacobin magazine. And they published an article for the centenary of the October Revolution in 2017. It's called The New Communists. It has some advice for us. It says, stop worrying about the old answers to old questions. Today, the probability of a socialist revolution is infinitesimally small. The world's working class has moved on, and yet the far left today embraces the Soviet obsession like a vampire hunter wields garlic. They say the left is held back by its inability to move on from these dreams of apocalyptic rupture. Well, that's the voice of a petty bourgeois variety of socialism that is currently withering into dust. The young generation has not moved on from dreams of revolution. Instead, they moved on from Jacobin magazine. They moved on from a brand of democratic socialism that would sneer at October. History has moved on from them. Does anyone remember what was happening in the United States 4 years ago this week? I think Donald Trump remembers, because he was hiding in a bunker under the White House. And there were 26 million people in the streets. And Trump ordered the U.S. Army to prepare to deploy across U.S. cities within the space of 5 hours. And dozens of generals at the Pentagon were warning him that he risked playing his last card if he did that. And 54% of the population thought it was justified when protesters in Minneapolis burnt down the police precinct. And in a growing number of neighborhoods, regular working class people were taking up arms and setting up patrols to defend their neighborhoods against the police and against right-wing thugs. So it's not such an old question, is it? I'm very interested in how the Bolsheviks pulled off their miracle. Because there's nothing more important in my life than participating in the replication of that achievement in the United States in my lifetime, just like thousands of us are trying to achieve around the world. At the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1920, delegates from around the world showed up in Moscow, an international gathering, something like like this international gathering. And in their rooms, the delegates found some Congress documents that they had to read to prepare for the proceedings. One of them was a booklet that Lenin had written for the delegates. And it was intended to teach them how the Bolsheviks achieved victory so that they could apply the lessons in their own countries. It was called Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder. And I love that the beginning of the book just dives right in, so concise, so clear. He starts an indispensable condition for the success of the Bolsheviks. He said, we could not have retained power for 2.5 months, let alone 2.5 years, without the most rigorous and truly iron discipline in our party. He says, overthrowing the bourgeoisie is impossible without a long, stubborn, desperate life and death struggle. It calls for tenacity, for self-sacrifice, for a single, inflexible will. Lenin explains that as a current of political thought and as a political party, Bolshevism began since in 1903. And he said, only the history of Bolshevism during its entire existence can explain where that discipline came from. He gives a few of the main points to explain where that discipline came from. First, it comes from something inside the proletarian vanguard. There has to be a generation with a sense of self-sacrifice and devotion. That comes from class consciousness, from recognizing your position in society. It also comes from history, from living in a society that makes people say, I want nothing more than to bring this system down. Lenin says, secondly, those people have to be merged with the working class. They have to sink roots. It's like a plant needs to be anchored in the soil. And it's moving, those roots are collecting nutrients from the soil. And the party is sending ideas into the working class, but it's also receiving insights from the working class. Lenin said the third condition is the party has to have correct ideas. It needs to have the right tactics, the right strategy. It needs to understand where reality is heading. And the working class has to be able to verify through their own experience that the party's position is correct. Lenin explains that Bolshevism arose on the granite foundation of Marxist theory. And really, the party was a vehicle for transmitting those ideas. It was training leaders who could use Marxism to actually think, to apply it to reality. And finally, Lenin points out in this chapter that there was 15 years of really intense experience that the party went through leading up to 1917. It was unequaled anywhere in the world in such a short space of time to go through so many forms of the movement. Legal and illegal, peaceful and stormy, underground and open, local circles, mass movements, parliamentary forms, and battles on the barricades. All of that was necessary to train the cadres of Bolshevism. They needed ideological training, they needed a disciplined structure, they needed to have fierce internal debates and be connected to the international debates of the Marxist movement. They had to go through multiple revolutions, multiple wars, multiple periods of reaction. The benefit is that all of that happened in a pretty short space of time, and it produced these cadres. When we define Bolshevism, we often refer to like psychological traits, like having an iron will, the determination to smash all obstacles. I think these are part of the definition. I think it contains part of the picture, because you can imagine what it would mean if you think to lead a modern day uprising of the working class. You better have something special. You need a strong psychology. You need an ideological backbone. But this is one of the best definitions that I've seen of Bolshevism was published by the Communist International in 1925. Bolshevism is not merely a doctrine, but a system of revolutionary training for the proletarian uprising. And what does the revolutionary training of the cadres consist of? It is giving them such a training and effecting such a selection of the leading staff as would prevent them from drifting when the hour for their October strikes. I think that's an excellent definition of Bolshevism. That was written by the architect of the October insurrection himself, Leon Trotsky. You know, the Bolshevik Party was a party of cadres. It was a cadre organization. When you have a small, well-organized body that has a lot of expertise, and it's capable of expanding rapidly into a massive force and taking in a big influx of new people and transmit organization and expertise to that big expanded body, that's the general function of a cadre organization in the abstract. I have a dictionary definition here of a cadre. A group of trained or otherwise qualified personnel capable of forming, training, or leading an expanded organization. Now think about it in a wartime context. This is used often in a military sense. Militaries will define a cadre as a key group of officers and enlisted personnel necessary to establish and train a new military unit. Think about the process of raising an army for a wartime mobilization. You have a draft, a wartime conscription, and broad layers of the population are being drafted into the army. And new soldiers, they're enlisted, they're put through a rapid basic training. The goal is to make them battle ready in the shortest possible space of time. and then they're given a weapon, they're assigned to a unit, they're given their marching orders on the battlefield. Well, in 1917, those 8,000 Bolsheviks were the general staff of October, and they raised a mass revolutionary party in much the same way. Remember, starting from 8,000, they grew 30-fold. That's 250,000. And that averages out to, if you were to take that increase and average it out over those 8 months, that's 1,000 people joining you every day for 8 months. And instead of arming them with a gun and deploying them on the battlefield, they armed them with a program. And they were assigned to go back to their workplace and explain the program to their coworkers and win them over to it. Of course, the general staff that raises an army has to be very well trained. The bourgeois states have their military academies, and they don't just train their staff to just give commands. They train them in the theory of war. They study history. They study society. They even study psychology. They need to have the ability to think under immense pressure. Well, again, the entire history of the Bolshevik Party created those kinds of people. I want to run through some of this history, beginning with the early beginnings. The forerunners of the Bolshevik, there was a pre-Marxist revolutionary movement called the Narodniks. Their slogan was, "Go to the people." And they thought the peasantry was going to be the force to carry out a revolution. And most of these were middle-class students and intellectuals. And they gave up their normal lives and comforts to try and spark a peasant uprising to bring down the Tsar. This started in the 1860s. It kind of reached a high point in the 1870s. It reached a crisis in the 1880s. And the tactics varied, but the movement became a terrorist movement. These were young kids building bombs and trying to assassinate Tsarist officials. And they actually killed one of the Tsars, Alexander II, in 1881. Lenin's own brother was a Narodnik, and he was arrested for his attempt to assassinate Alexander III, the Tsar, the next Tsar. He was in prison for several months, and then one day the jailer comes and says, "You have 2 hours left. We're going to hang you." And his final words were the words of a revolutionary. He said, "I had but one aim, to help the unfortunate Russian people. There is no finer death. Such a death holds no terror for sincere and honest men." Well, that honest man had just turned 21 years old. These people were willing to sacrifice their lives for the cause. As far as tenacity and self-sacrifice goes, these people were heroes. And that spirit of Narodnism was inherited by the Bolsheviks. They had the tenacity, but they didn't have the roots in the working class, and they didn't have the correct ideas. By the 1880s, the movement was at an impasse because all the leaders were imprisoned, and they had made no headway winning the peasantry. And in the year 1880, one of these Narodniks had to flee abroad, and he discovers the ideas of Marxism. It was life-changing. It blew his mind. The answers to all of the questions that he had. And this is a quote from that man. "Anyone who did not live through those times can hardly imagine the eagerness with which we threw ourselves into the study of Marxist literature. The more we read, the more we realized the weak points of our earlier views. The theories of Marx, they guided us out of this labyrinth that we were stuck in." That was Georgy Plekhanov, the father of Russian Marxism. In 1883, he founded the first Marxist organization in Russia, the Emancipation of Labor Group. And it's pretty amazing if you think that's a huge country, 140 million probably at the time, and there's no Marxists there. Pretty much no one's heard of Marxism. It has no influence. This group of 5 people has no resources or visibility. They're trying to bring a new ideology into that kind of scenario. That was 1883. Now think of the timeline. By the end of the 1890s, by the end of the following decade, here's how Lenin described the political landscape. Marxist books were published one after another. Marxist journals and newspapers were founded. Nearly everyone became a Marxist. Anyway, the point is the entire revolutionary movement abandoned Narodnism and shifted over to Marxism. It was a very dramatic shift. And the revolutionary generation felt illuminated by materialism, by dialectics, by historical materialism. The effect was that there was a mushrooming, a spontaneous popping up of Marxist discussion groups all over Russia. It started with intelligentsia and students, and these were really dense writings. They were studying theory and philosophy. They were studying the roots of Marxism. But in the 1890s, the working class was growing rapidly. There was a rapid industrialization. And suddenly the class struggle became something very concrete. The theory and reality corresponded perfectly. So the movement made efforts to bring these ideas to the working class. They were forming circles of factory workers who were studying Marxist theory. Meanwhile, the entire apparatus of Tsarism that had been hunting the Narodniks for decades is now targeting the Marxists and arresting them and confiscating their literature. This was the state of the movement when Lenin began his political activity. He became active in 1893 in St. Petersburg. Within 2 years, he was arrested, like so many other revolutionaries. He wasn't released for 5 more years. He spent 5 years in Tsarist prisons and exile, thinking, reading, studying, but also analyzing the movement. He was obsessively developing a plan. The the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was actually founded while he was in exile. And I should explain that the social democracy at the time was the way that the international Marxist movement referred to itself. The Second International had been founded in 1889, less than a decade before this party had been founded. Anyway, Lenin was in Siberia drafting Congress documents that were smuggled to this Congress. There was just 9 delegates. Almost all of them were immediately arrested after the Congress, and that was it. Lenin saw that the party was beginning. It was taking steps forward, but there was so much that still remained to be done. Lenin was released in 1900, and he immediately got to work transforming those scattered, disorganized forces into a professional, effective revolutionary party. He wrote What is to be Done. And this was a really sharp polemic. Just like Plekhanov, Lenin learned, he took a lot from Plekhanov, but he learned this really incredible polemical style. And when you read it, it can sometimes seem like a vicious beatdown. But there wasn't anything mean-spirited about him. He had one concern: clarity. How do you get the cadres to see the mistake, the inconsistency of the opponent? Well, this is what he does in What is to be Done. He's polemicizing against different publications, against a trend called The Economists. That can be summed up by saying, the economic struggle is for the workers, leave the political struggle to the liberals. He had this condescending middle-class view that the workers were incapable of grappling with theory, and really was opening the door to a soft version of Marxism, a reformist version of Marxism. The essence of the argument in What is to be Done is that the movement has been going through phases. Lenin's analyzing the development of the movement. He said, we've made huge strides. We have all of these circles springing up everywhere, but it has serious shortcomings. It's amateurish, it's uncoordinated, it's disorganized, it's chaotic. And the worst part is this is supposed to be a Marxist movement, and its leaders are vacillating on their Marxism. But What is to be Done was like a battle plan for addressing the situation, bringing order and professionalism to the scattered circles and putting Marxism at the center of it, using the ideas of Marxism to build a disciplined core. Launching the paper Iskra in 1900 was a practical major step in this direction. It wasn't just a paper, it was a network of agents that brought consciousness to all of the circles that they were part of one big phenomenon. The movement started to recognize itself. It started to talk to each other. They were reading each other's reports. And this was, a period of establishing order. You had committees, one committee in every city. Below the committee, you had district committees. Those district committees coordinated factory committees. Factory committees had subcommittees. And there was a whole web of technical committees. This is where the word committee man comes from this period. But you needed a detailed division of labor in order to conduct clandestine work. This was the situation at the time of the Second Congress in 1903. And without getting into details of the debate that took place there, it was a struggle over what kind of party are we going to have. Will it be a professional cadre organization or a broad, loose organization? It seemed to be a clash over organizational questions, but it had a deeper significance. Lenin said later, those differences really only came out in 1905. And that year was like a trial by fire for all the parties. Bloody Sunday, January 9th, 140,000 march to petition the Tsar peacefully. Over 4,000 are shot in cold blood by the Tsarist officials. Hundreds of them die. Just like that, a revolution begins. The workers are picking up the bodies and carrying them on carts through the city, marching, saying, give us arms. 3 million workers go on a political strike, and then it escalates into an insurrection. In this situation, the party needed a totally different form. That cadre skeleton needed to take in the influx. It needed to do what it's supposed to do and expand. And the party committees resisted. You see how that period of discipline, of trying to tighten things up, that created habits that then became an obstacle when the situation changed. Lenin said that every month of 1905 was like a year's worth of education during normal periods. You had the rise of the Soviets out of strike committees. They represented hundreds of thousands of workers across hundreds of factories. They coordinated strikes, but through the strike action, they were actually playing the role of a governing force. They achieved freedom of press. They had a shorter working day. They took over the railways, the telegraphs, the postal service. They set up regular street patrols. They were acting like a government. Well, there was different conceptions of what the Soviets represented. The Mensheviks supported the Soviets, and they even helped set them up. But they thought the Soviets should be like a non-political labor congress. Or they thought it could become like a reformist labor party, like a European workers' party. This was the position of the Mensheviks. And really, the Mensheviks had kind of grown out of economism. They wanted to adapt the workers' movement to the interests of the liberal capitalist class. Because their view of Marxism was a rigid view. They thought that Tsarism represented, because it was a remnant of feudalism, then Tsarism should be overthrown and replaced by capitalism. And therefore, the task of the revolutionary movement should be to support the liberals against the Tsar. Okay, the position of Lenin in relation to the tasks of the revolution. He didn't have any illusions in the capitalist class. He thought Tsarism should be replaced by a coalition between the workers and the peasantry. He called it a democratic dictatorship of the peasantry and the proletariat. And basically, this would exclude the bourgeoisie, and it would achieve democratic rights for the workers. And he said a revolution that achieved that would then it would have a huge impact in Europe. And once the workers of Europe move, then they could advance to a socialist revolution. But when the Soviets emerged, Lenin's position evolved a little bit. He saw the Soviets and he said, this could be the embryo of a workers' government. That was exactly Trotsky's position, by the way. And I should explain that in 1903, when you had that really intense factional fight between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, when it appeared to be over organizational issues like an unjustified reason to split the party, at that specific juncture, Trotsky sided against Lenin with the Mensheviks. As soon as those divisions started to exhibit political content, Trotsky became independent of both factions. And he had the perspective that it should be possible to bring everyone together, to win everyone to a correct position and have a large unified party. He probably looked at Lenin and said, you have a hard-line view. You're not allowing the party to come together. I believe Trotsky looked back at that position and said that was the greatest mistake of his life. And maybe it was those 5 years in exile in prison that allowed Lenin to see this thing very clearly, because he saw it more clearly than anybody else. But Lenin wanted ideological homogeneity, a party of people that think the same way, that are rowing in the same direction, people who are completely devoted, who are not competing. The party's not competing for their time and attention with other interests. No, the truth is the Mensheviks wanted the party to be open to like fellow travelers and like intellectuals and sympathetic people. So those were the two trends within Russian social democracy. They ended up really diverging later. But I mention this because at every juncture, the political position of Lenin and Trotsky was almost exactly the same. At an early stage, Lenin had seen this. He had tried to get Trotsky to join the Iskra editorial board. Anyway, once the split happened, Trotsky was not a Bolshevik for many years. Anyway, that's an aside. Going back to 1905, Lenin and Trotsky both see the Soviets as the embryo of a workers' government. But the Bolshevik committeemen, they saw the Soviets as competition against the party. They were suspicious of them. The vast majority of Bolsheviks, they were like, we should boycott the Soviet, or we should present an ultimatum that the Soviet should be under the discipline of the party, or else we should try to dissolve the Soviet. One Bolshevik in the conference in 1905 said, I think we should try to get into the Soviet and then explode it from within. Because they had been trained, we need a strict party, we need a strict line. We don't want all this variety. We don't want a non-Bolshevik party to emerge and confuse the workers. At this stage, Lenin was in a battle against his own cadres on this score as well. But he had the ability to size up a situation and understand, to perceive the broader significance of events. Not just to see the immediate reality in front of him, but to anticipate the direction of events. Lenin was always concerned with preparing the party for what was about to happen, to position the party so that it could benefit from the future situation. What activity can the party do today so that it can connect with the workers tomorrow? This is dialectics, by the way. Well, on the back of 1905, eventually the party did open up to an influx. And actually, under the impact of the events, the ranks of the Bolshevik and Menshevik committees, they just started merging spontaneously. Their attitude was, yeah, we've had our differences in the past, but this is the revolution. The slogan of 1905 was down with the autocracy. They could all agree on that. They were all advocating a general strike. They wanted to move the insurrection forward. Now, what would have happened if the insurrection had succeeded in 1905? That's another question. They would not have been in agreement in that case. But at this stage, there was organic pressure for unity, and the party those factions actually did unite. So actually, they had a formal unity at the Stockholm Unity Congress in 1906, and they basically brought Bolshevism and Menshevism back into one happy family. Now, keep in mind, up until the breakout of 1905, the party was not big. This is maybe a couple thousand, maybe the Bolsheviks numbered just in the hundreds. And on the back of 1905, the party became a mass force for the first time in its history. It grew to a mass party of 150,000. And Lenin says the hundreds of revolutionary social democrats suddenly grew into thousands. And the thousands became the leaders of between 2 and 3 million proletarians. So you can see already at this stage, that cadre function had played a massive role. Now, there was a lot of debate. It really was not a happy family. I mean, they had a lot of serious divisions. Sometimes you wonder, why did this marriage stay together so long, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks? Because it was 9 years before they actually separated. But I think it had to do with the fact that the social democracy was a pretty young movement internationally. And, Marxism was having its first time as a mass phenomenon. So for the longest time, it was unthinkable to have the Social Democrats splitting. How could you possibly split the party? And what wasn't clear at the time was that there was two souls within social democracy, even internationally. And the most advanced Marxists, they recognized this, and they were detecting it at an earlier stage and trying to push against it and fight against it. It had to do with the fact that capitalism at that stage, it was at a younger phase of the system. It had 40 years of an upswing up until, World War I. And I think Marx died in 83, Engels died in 95, I think, 1895. And the German SPD was a huge authority in the world. That was a genuine mass party, had influence over millions for sure. But during that long period, a process had taken place, and they had started to adapt to a comfortable, peaceful period of capitalism. The point is this conflict of this two trends that were coexisting in Russian social democracy, it's a symptom of something that was happening internationally. And the split that eventually happened it foreshadowed the split that happened internationally between the Second International and then the Third. Anyway, I want to go back to 1905. After the defeat of that revolution, that was another phase of the movement. You see, a cadre organization, you can go from a small core into a massive expansion. That's not necessarily just a one-way development. You can also lose that big influx and be reduced once again to the core. Lenin said, the parties we were learning to attack, now we had to learn to retreat. When everything's moving forward and the energy is rising and the ranks are swelling, it's all going in one direction, it can be quite easy if you feel like you're just growing as a force of nature, just like because of momentum. And what Lenin understood is that this is going to recede now. This revolution, it was defeated. And now the question is, who can keep their forces intact? How do you preserve that core? That's the only guarantee of the future. That's the only way that it's like you have to prepare for a period of reaction. You have one hope for getting through the other end in one piece, and that's the education of the cadres. And so that was always Lenin's concern, especially when the 1905 revolution started to recede. But the whole history of the party, yes, they started learning Marxism with books. That's how they started. The real education was events and then the interaction between the theory and the events. You can learn about dialectics, like everything is always changing. Everything contains something different within itself. And every situation is always in the process of bringing that other thing out. It's another thing to keep your bearings when these events are actually unfolding and the situation is being transformed dramatically. But that's the thing that Lenin was a master at. Anyway, one of the central points of contention, one of these debates that really educated the ranks was about the Duma. Now, this is a new situation. Tsarism, a repressive regime. There's no democratic outlet. There's no parliament, obviously. And of course, in 1905, the Soviets are emerging and the Tsarist regime is panicking. In August 1905, when the revolution was approaching its height, it was at full swing, the regime makes a desperate attempt to channel it back into something safe. And an initiative under the minister Buligin, they appeal to the workers, we have something for you. We're going to set up a consultative body, and it's not going to actually be able to make laws, but we're going to hear your voice. You can elect some delegates to it. It's kind of like a Soviet. Well, the workers didn't. The workers ignored it. They rejected it. It was swept away almost immediately by the revolution itself. And all the social democrats at this point had the same attitude toward it. We boycott that thing. Show the workers that they have the power to dissolve this Tsarist institution. Don't go into an institution of the Tsar. You have the Soviets. Rely on your own strength. That was a position in 1905. 1906, totally different situation. There was a focal point, an insurrection attempted in December of 1905 in Moscow. Basically, an advanced section of the workers is moving to try in an armed uprising. But it's already kind of gone over the peak. They're appealing to the soldiers to mutiny, and the mutiny fails. This is when the Tsarist regime passes on to the offensive. They spot that opportunity. You have this minister Stolypin step in, the hangman of the revolution. And he starts, thousands are arrested, hundreds are executed, and now the revolution's going downhill. But the Tsarist ministers decided, let's set up another Duma. Let's see if the workers are interested now. This was in 1906. And the majority of the Bolsheviks rejected. No, another sham Duma? Of course, no. We'll boycott it again. And to their surprise, this time Lenin saying, wait a minute. No, we should participate in this Duma. The situation's changing. This is one of our only legal opportunities to put our ideas into the public. Anyway, Lenin lost that vote, and the Bolsheviks boycott the Duma. The main liberal bourgeois party, the Cadets, that's short for Constitutional Democrats, they flood the Duma. And so in this public platform that the workers are watching, there's no Marxist voice to be heard. Now, Lenin said that was a mistake. He said it was a minor mistake, though. It wasn't, a super serious one. The Tsar was irritated at all this criticism he was getting from the liberals, and he decides to dissolve the Duma within 42 days anyway. In the meantime, the party is going through this intense internal battle. Do we present candidates? Do we not? Do we boycott it? Because 4 months later, see, the Tsar realized they needed certain institutions. They were caught unaware in 1905. They had no way to channel the movement. If you can set up something and then you can control it, it's a safety valve. So a few months later, in November 1907, they do another Duma. And this time, more Bolsheviks are willing to support it. And the Mensheviks are very willing. They're starting to look at this like, okay, maybe we could get some reforms passed here. We can pressure the Tsar. The socialists that talk about pressuring the Tsar? Well, the Tsar wasn't impressed. He wasn't pressured. And he decides to dissolve that Duma as well. And for good measure, all 54 Social Democratic delegates to that Duma were all arrested and sent to exile. Get them out of the way. So that was called the Red Duma because the Social Democrats had participated. Under Stolypin's initiative, they set up another Duma. That's kind of like the Tsar is like using successive approximations to get the balance just right. They want the right kind of Duma, So they tried the Red Duma. Now they have the Black Duma. This is Stolypin's Duma. They made sure the pro-Tsarist monarchists dominated this Duma. And its powers were even more limited than all the others. And the Tsar was pretty happy with this one. It lasted for 5 years, actually. All right. Now the Bolsheviks, think about the Bolshevik debate about do we participate or not. Now they're looking at this Black Duma. By now they really don't want to participate in this Duma. And Lenin has the opposite view. He really, really wants them to. He fought a vicious, exhausting battle for years to convince them that they had to participate. And behind that immediate conflict, you could see Lenin understood how to prepare for the future. This was a long period of reaction. It was a very brutal, demoralizing reaction. And for the workers, that was the only public evidence of any opposition to the Tsar. Lenin was saying it would be criminal if we did not utilize every single opportunity, every foothold the party has. In the meantime, you have to understand the party is collapsing. I mean, from the perspective of a lot of the ranks, a lot of the core ranks, that was it. Like that was the opportunity of a lifetime, and now it's over. And the big influx that, all of those people that had recently joined the party, they just, they're gone, they're out. This period of reaction really started in 1908 and it lasted until like 1911. At one point, Lenin's in touch with like just a couple dozen people in all of Russia. That's his forces. But the Mensheviks are even in a worse position. I mean, they practically liquidated. So Lenin's desperately just trying to reinforce the cadres, One of the expressions of this period of reaction and demoralization was ideological wavering. Guess what? Suddenly people start to have doubts about materialism. They start to look inward like, I don't know, maybe Marxism let us down here. And they look inward, it becomes a very like introspective period. People lose perspective. Lenin was on a mission to provide perspective, to fight against that, to defend materialism. Eventually, the Bolsheviks did come out the other end. There was light at the end of the tunnel. In 1912, there was an atrocity. The Tsarist regime massacred some workers that were striking at the Lena gold mine. And it's like it brought something back to life in the working class. It brought their anger back. It brought, it made them want to fight again. At this point, after years of these horribly frustrating debates that were happening, I mean, if you understand the amount of factions that were in Lenin's own group for all this period of reaction, it's not just that the Bolsheviks wanted to boycott the Duma. It's like you had 5 different trends that wanted to boycott the Duma in different ways. And the Mensheviks wanted to melt themselves into the Duma and liquidate the party and just be a legal faction in parliament. And within each of the factions, there was also a lot of conciliators that wanted to strike a deal with another faction. And Lenin's constantly trying to reinforce people and have something solid and find allies. Well, that was what the experience of that depressing period of reaction was like. I mean, it's not fun. In 1912, after that Lena massacre, when the working class starts to look up and raise its head again, it's like a breath of fresh air. Finally, now we can get to work. Like they came out of that period. And this was the time when Lenin was like, enough of the Mensheviks. We're going to break with them. And they actually have a congress of all the Bolshevik committees in the name of the RSDLP. the name of the whole party. And they declared, we're the party now. It's the Bolsheviks. But what's amazing is how the party just takes off after that. It's like they had liberated themselves from the dead weight of this group of people that didn't get it. They have their delegates in the Duma, and they're doing it the Bolshevik way now. They use dozens and dozens of opportunities to actually make revolutionary agitation to expose the Tsarist regime. Within a couple years, 4/5 of the politically active working class, 4/5 of them are supporting the Bolsheviks. In fact, the Bolsheviks now independently become a mass party again. And the strike wave is on the rise again. Now, if you're thinking this is the phase where they prepared for October, they became a mass force, the Bolsheviks were clear. No, the whole thing collapsed again. So World War I broke out, and there was a wave of patriotism, and the socialist movement was crushed. That must have been a bit disappointing, to say the least, after that. But the Bolshevik delegates, they were in the Duma when World War I broke out, and they behaved heroically. They were put under immense pressure. And instead of buckling to that pressure, they denounced the war. They refused to vote for the war credits. They make revolutionary speeches. They're all arrested. They're all put on trial. They use the trials to do revolutionary agitation against the war. And all of them are given life sentences in Siberia. But eventually that paid off, because the initial enthusiasm for the war didn't take long to wear off and turn into misery. And the workers remembered those speeches. They remembered the position of the Bolsheviks. Lenin later said, when 1917 broke out, the revolution, one of the reasons that the Bolsheviks were able to grow dramatically, grow 30-fold, was precisely because they had been perceived by the workers as the most hardline opponents of the regime within the reactionary Duma. They had participated in all legal opportunities. They had sunk roots in the working class. And when 1917 broke out, it became clear suddenly why all of those years of intense debates were so crucial. And there was one final battle to be had. At the start of 1917, when the workers rose up and the Soviets emerge again, and this time it's the Soviets emerge and they sweep aside the Tsarist regime. This was the real opportunity of a lifetime. This was the moment that the Bolsheviks had prepared their whole lives for. Most of the leading cadres at this time, they had joined the movement like in 1903. They'd mostly joined in their 20s, some of them younger. And they'd spent decades talking about the coming revolution, talking about this perspective in the abstract. And at this moment, when they were faced with that reality, the Tsar had been overthrown, the armed workers are in the streets, the Soviets in practice were the ruling force. Most of the comrades didn't understand that this was the moment to bring the working class to power. As soon as Lenin arrived in Russia in April, he spent 3 weeks trying to wake up the party and shake them, straining every nerve to convince them politically that this is the moment. And the debates in the party at that time are so fascinating because it's like you see the conflict between theory and reality just clarifying itself in the moment. And the Bolshevik cadres they're using arguments that had come from the history of the party. They're saying, what about our program about the democratic dictatorship of the peasantry and the proletariat? And Lenin says theory is gray, the tree of life is green. This is it. Is that things played out differently than we could have ever expected. But now that the Soviets have created a power, they shouldn't have handed it back to the bourgeoisie. And that is that's the new power that should become the state. All power to the Soviets. In the time of this cadre expansion of like thousands and thousands joining the party, that's what those people were armed with to go back into their workplaces, into their factories. The April theses, all power to if you want to end the war, you have to end capitalism. We should also point out that this whole history of debates, every time there was all these crises and internal faction fights, that was a period of clarification that educated. Now, this is the way that democratic centralism functions. This is something that Lenin also really developed and insisted on. You have full freedom of discussion to compare all the views, take a vote, majority rules, and it's full unity in action. Now, in April, there was a ton of confusion in the party. I mean, really, Lenin shocked everybody when he came and gave this position. After all those years of cadre training, it's not like you had those 8,000 members were not 8,000 Lenins, but they were cadres. They were trained in Marxism. And democratic centralism allowed them to hear that view in the debate, a battle of ideas. There's like an arena of different ideas. Democratic centralism is designed for Marxism to prevail in that battle. Like everyone in the room is putting their Marxism together. They're putting their heads together, and it's like a collective compass. And when the correct position is put forward, that compass has to respond and say, that's it. That's the real position. That is the only way. That's the only organizational form that allows an organization to have like materialist dialectics in the driver's seat. And it only works if you have a lot of Marxists. You have to have a core of people that don't just have theoretical abstractions in their heads and memorize phrases. That core has to be made of people that can understand reality as it's unfolding, who are capable of recognizing the moment when it's time to gather every inch of your strength, when you better get your last drop of courage because it's time to step up to the ultimate test. From beginning to end, the Bolshevik Party was the history of creating Marxists. Bolshevism isn't exactly separate from Marxism. Ideologically, Marx, Engels, those ideas, that method, that's what Lenin defended. And very few people actually got it in a very deep way. A lot of people filtered through those ranks. A lot of people didn't pass the test. But there was a core of cadres that did. They pushed through to the end. That generation of Bolsheviks that we said at the beginning, that tenacity, that first ingredient of having something inside, that was created by the conditions of Tsarism. You can thank Tsarism for creating such a destructive force that brought it down. But comrades, modern day capitalism in the 2020s is creating an even more destructive force. That thing that the Narodniks felt inside, that the Bolsheviks felt, history is producing that again. It doesn't always produce that ingredient. That's a special ingredient. At certain times it pops up. A generation of people that say, there is nothing more important in my life than to be a participant in the end of capitalism. History is producing that again. You can feel it. You can feel it getting reinforced. Point is, that's one component. The other component is depth, the granite foundation of Marxist theory, the ability to think like materialists, the ability to understand how the new reality is emerging from the current reality. We can bring these things together, comrades, with the ideas of this international. We'll create a new generation of Bolsheviks.
If you are a communist and you're not organized, you need to get organized with the Revolutionary Communists of America, part of the newly founded Revolutionary Communist International. There's a link in the description to join us now. Watch the other sessions from this world event. Become theoretically grounded, just like the Bolsheviks did, because we have a fight in front of us, comrades, and we need to prepare.